Okay, we've been looking at, I don't know if you can remember where we are, but we're looking at the new atheist claims that God is a moral monster. And they bring a number of specific charges. And we've been looking at the claim that God's regulations regarding slavery are immoral. And we saw that in the Old Testament, there really wasn't slavery among God's people, Israel. That what you had within that community was this voluntary form of debt servitude that served a humanitarian function. But we saw that in the Old Testament, God permitted Israelites to have non-Israelites as slaves, but He allowed them to do so under conditions that He specified. So Israel could do that, but they were required to grant the non-Israelite slaves protections that were unique in the ancient world. For example, they had to give them rest on the Sabbath. And they had a number of protections against overzealous discipline. And I like that text in Job that reflects God's attitude toward slaves, where Job is defending his righteousness. And there you see that they were to treat Israelites, because Job is using this as an example of his righteousness. Israelites were to treat slaves justly in recognition of the fact that slaves were created by the same God who made the master. You see, and I think that's very important that you see that seed there. Now, I speculated that God may have distinguished the situation of Israelites from non-Israelites, so that within Israel there was only voluntary debt servitude. With non-Israelites, Israelites could have non-Israelites as slaves. Why would God do that? And I speculated that He may have distinguished the two situations with regard to this regulated form of slavery that He tolerated. He may have done that to emphasize the link between divine blessing and covenant membership. You see, it may be a way of saying, do you see that within the community here, this is where the blessings are? And when you recognize that non-Israelites could convert to Judaism and they could thus share in all the blessings of God, that takes some of that edge away also. Now, in the first century, God tolerated a regulated form of Greco-Roman slavery, which I explained was very different from colonial slavery, the slavery with which we're most familiar. This Greco-Roman slavery was a very different institution, and God didn't just tolerate Greco-Roman slavery. He tolerated a regulated form of Greco-Roman slavery. And as I said last week, the seeds for all slavery's dissolution, those seeds were sown in Old Testament and New Testament texts, and those seeds eventually bloomed in the eradication of this man-made institution of slavery. That's what happened. The early church, you saw it go, and then you saw the empire strike back, and then ultimately was the Christian force that eliminated slavery, at least in the West, but there are still, especially in Islamic world, slavery still continues. Now, I speculate, say, well, why is God doing that? You know, when you put me in that position, I just have to think of possibilities. And I speculated that God, in His omniscience, He may have chosen to gradually eliminate slavery. He may have chosen to do that because of the suffering that would have resulted in that historical context if God had mandated abrupt termination as Christianity exploded across the Roman Empire. It was very much embedded that the world had gotten so twisted and dark, and you had this embedded in the economic system. It is certainly possible that if He had mandated the abrupt termination of this, as Christianity spread, that anarchy would have resulted, and there would have been tremendous suffering in the society as a result. You see, I'm not smart enough to know. I'm not omniscient to know could God be doing that as a rationale. And to the extent that we, His people, were slower than we should have been to bring to bear on slavery the implications of the gospel, you say, well, why did it go that slowly? Well, maybe that's our fault. You see, maybe God's saying, okay, the thorn needs to be extracted slowly. The dark world that is so sin entangled needs to be altered under the influence of Christianity first, and in that process, then this thorn can be extracted. Maybe this is what God is doing. You say, well, why so slowly? Well, so slowly, maybe that's because we didn't do what we should have done in bringing to bear on slavery the implications of the gospel. But God you can't throw that at his feet and then conclude from that he's pro-slavery. He's not pro-slavery. But that's the charge that is made to try to get people intimidated. People of faith say, well, I can't defend God. God needs no defending. You see, he needs no defending. And you look into it and you can see these kinds of things that I'm telling you. Now, in this context of a regulated form of first century Greco-Roman slavery, if release was desired, you see these ideas, we looked at the text about brotherhood. He used to be a brother, this idea of brotherhood between master and slave. In that context, if release was desired, it needed to be worked out on an individual basis consistent with the principle of brotherhood. So that I come and I say, listen, this is my situation and circumstance. I understand that you have an investment and we work this out. But until it was worked out, as long as the relationship remained, God says that the slave couldn't take advantage of having a brother for a master. In other words, he couldn't say, okay, this guy's my brother. He serves the Lord Jesus Christ, so now I can take advantage of him. I won't work. No, he said, you can't do that. And as long as that relationship remained, he tells the master, you cannot mistreat the slave. Okay, so that's important. And then God tolerated, God tolerated this regulated form of first century slavery does not mean that God would tolerate that same form of slavery, that regulated, altered form of first century slavery. It does not mean that he would tolerate that same form of slavery in a different social setting or context. You see, it may be he's tolerating it because stuff had gotten so intertwined that to yank the thorn in that context would have created great suffering. So you can't then just jump from the fact that he tolerated it then and there to say he would tolerate that same form of slavery in other contexts. Nor can you conclude that he would tolerate other forms of slavery, such as the slavery of colonial America. He certainly would not, as that involved man stealing. He certainly wouldn't have tolerated that. Okay, so that's an important thing to see, that you have those elements and those aspects involved there. All right, that's talking about those. We're looking at the atheist objections, their claim that God is a moral monster. I spent a long time on slavery because they make a big deal about that. Okay? But now I want to look at this idea, something it's really quite funny to me. They sometimes accuse God of immorality by claiming that the Old Testament endorsed, or that God in the Old Testament endorsed or approved of polygamous marriages. You see, including concubines who were second-class wives, but they were wives nonetheless. You can see that, for example, Bilhah is called both a concubine and one of Jacob's wives in Genesis 35:22 and 37:2. Now, let me remind you, the atheist has no basis for holding to an objective morality. If you were here when I went through all that, you know why I say that. They have no basis for holding to an objective morality from which they can criticize God. And so it's odd on that score, but it's also, it almost becomes surreal because so many atheists, you see, they don't believe that marriage is between one man and one woman. In fact, there are many of them that never met a sexual relationship they don't like. And so it's just something to have them sitting here saying, your God is immoral because he endorsed polygamy. I said, well, you'd think that's fine, right? Many of them would. But I think, what I want to do, I want to address this charge from within the Christian worldview. And the question is God culpable? Is he morally blameworthy for allegedly endorsing or approving of polygamous marriages in the Old Testament? Can blame be laid on God? And I want to tell you that a good case can be made, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but a good case can be made that God actually prohibited polygamy in the Old Testament. And though it occurred among his people, nobody can deny that, those occurrences were in fact contrary to his will. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But even if God didn't prohibit polygamy in the Mosaic law, even if you say, no, I see that and I don't think that's right. Even if God did not prohibit polygamy under the Mosaic law, the most that could be said is that he tolerated it temporarily as a departure from his ideal, and you'll see it's his ideal as one man, one woman from Genesis. That he tolerated it as a departure from his ideal, presumably because of the hardness of men's hearts, as he did with divorce, right? Jesus says that. He says it wasn't this way in the beginning. Why did he do it? Because of the hardness of men's hearts. God had made a concession to the hardness of people's hearts. So presumably, if God didn't prohibit it, if he tolerated it in the Old Testament, you can't then say, well, he loves it. He didn't authorize it, he didn't command it, he didn't prescribe it, but he would be tolerating it, presumably, like I say, because of the hardness of men's hearts. God never commands it, he doesn't explicitly approve of polygamy, so it's presumptuous to tie him to it. Okay, now I want to talk about this idea that the Old Testament prohibits it. First, the creation design is for human sexuality to be expressed in a heterosexual, monogamous marriage. One man, one woman. That norm, you can see that norm summarized in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, and it's assumed throughout the Old Testament. In fact, Jesus cites the one flesh union of a man and a woman as God's ideal in Matthew chapter 19 and Mark chapter 10. And in fact, Paul indicates in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 30 to 32, citing Genesis 2:24. Okay, Ephesians 5, 30 to 32, Paul indicates that it was God's intention from the beginning for marriage to picture the relationship between Christ and his church. You see, a relationship that is by its nature exclusive. So I think that's an interesting thing. Now, the best presentation I know of the argument that God prohibited polygamy in the Old Testament is by the Old Testament scholar Richard Davidson in his monumental tome, The Flame of Yahweh, Sexuality in the Old Testament. Now, it would take too long, and I think it would become tedious for me to go through every text and touch on every text that would need to be touched on to make the case fully. But I commend to you Davidson's book, The Flame of Yahweh. But let me just say that in addition to the creation design for human sexuality that's summarized in Genesis 2:24 of one man and one woman, there are good reasons for thinking that Leviticus 18, chapter 18, verse 18, to see that as prohibiting polygamy generally, rather than to see it as prohibiting the more specific case, the incestuous case, of a man marrying his wife's sister. That's how it's often translated. That's how it's often understood. But what I want to suggest to you is that it makes good sense to see Leviticus 18:18 as prohibiting polygamy generally. I'm going to talk about that here in a second. That is, in fact, how the Qumran community interpreted Leviticus 18:18. Okay, Qumran community is made up of Essenes, a sect of Judaism, first century. That's how they understood Leviticus 18:18 as a prohibition of polygamy. Now, there are clear indications why I think that's the best way of looking at Leviticus 18:18. I should have put that up there. God does not endorse bigamy or polygamy. That's what we're talking about, okay? These are the charges that we've looked at on this idea, this claim. We've gone through these. The atheists claim God is immoral. We've been looking at these. Now we're looking at God does not endorse bigamy or polygamy. In Leviticus 18, 6 to 17, in that text there are clear indications when we get down to verse 18 that there is a break. The subject at verse 18, it shifts from laws that are forbidding sexual relationships on the basis of kinship, which is what you get in verses 6 through 17. They are forbidding sexual relationships on the basis of kinship, and then there is a switch at verse 18 to laws covering a broad range of forbidden sexual relationships that are not based on bonds of kinship. Verse 6 of Leviticus 18, it says, "None of you shall approach one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness," have sex with them. Okay? "I am the Lord." And then what you see in verses 7 through 17, in those verses you see that each one then specifies a close relationship with whom sex is forbidden, and it does so with the opening formula, all of them, 7 to 17. You get this statement, you shall not approach one of your close relatives to uncover nakedness. And then 7 to 17, all of them begin with, you shall not uncover the nakedness of, you shall not uncover the nakedness of, you shall not uncover the nakedness of. And each one of those statements is then followed by a specified close relationship with whom sexual relations is forbidden. Okay, so it makes perfect sense. Here are the incest laws. You shall not engage in incest. You shall not uncover the nakedness of this person, this person, this person, this person, this person. Okay, so you have that form there. But verse 18, you see, verse 18 breaks that pattern. When you get to verse 18, it doesn't say you shall not uncover the nakedness of. It is a literary break. You have this complete pattern, and then you get to verse 18, and it doesn't say that. It says, "Thou shalt not take a woman to her sister." You see, "thou shalt not take a woman to her sister." That's literally what the Hebrew says. That's the English Revised Version I quoted, just to show you that that's what the Hebrew says, and that version said it that way. Okay, "Thou shalt not take a woman to her sister to be a rival to her, to uncover her nakedness beside the other in her lifetime." So you see why people, if they're continuing to read this as part of the incest regulations, why they would then say, okay, well, that means wife's sister. That's also one of the incestual relationships that we're to avoid. But no, there's that literary break there. It doesn't follow that pattern. You shall not uncover the nakedness of. There is a switch here and a break to this broad range of forbidden sexual relationships, not based on kinship. This phrase that is commonly translated wife's sister that I've underlined there, literally a woman to her sister. That's the way it's translated, as I say, in the English Revised Version. It occurs 8 other times in the Hebrew Bible, and it's used idiomatically. A wife to her sister is used, a woman to her sister. A woman to her sister is used idiomatically for one in addition to another. I'll give you an example. Exodus 26:3. 5 curtains shall be coupled together, one to another. It is literally a woman to her sister. Okay? And the other 5 curtains shall be coupled one to another, a woman to her sister. You see, one to one matching it. You see? So it's one to another. You get Leviticus 26:6. "And thou shalt make 50 clasps of gold and couple the curtains one to another." Literally, a woman to her sister. "With the clasp, and the tabernacle shall be one." One more example. Ezekiel 1:9. "Their wings were joined one to another." A woman to her sister. You see, so you get this idea, right, of one that is similar, the same, being joined. And so the idea here, and by the way, this happens in the masculine equivalent. You have the masculine equivalent that is used, a man to his brother, is used a dozen times in the Hebrew Bible with this same idiomatic sense of one to another. So Leviticus 18:18, the phrase simply saying, look, taking a wife one to another. One wife to another. You see? Wife, wife. Gold loop, curtain, curtain. So it's taking one to another. It means adding one. Here's how Davidson concludes this. He says, this law then prohibits a man from taking another woman in addition to his first wife to be a rival wife, literally a vexer, as long as the first wife is alive. By implication, this law allows for remarriage after the death of the first wife. Thus, the monogamous norm of Genesis is upheld in this Mosaic legislation. So I think that's it's interesting to me. I think that's, that seems right when I see the literary break and I see the idiomatic use of this phrase. But then you say, well, wait a minute. Aren't there all kinds of texts where we can infer the divine approval of polygamy? You're probably thinking of texts Okay, so we have first on the idea that God prohibits polygamy is this text in Leviticus 18:18. And then you say, well, but doesn't that run against these other things? It doesn't run against those other texts. See, there are reasonable alternative explanations for those texts that are often cited as indications of divine approval of polygamy. And I want to run through some of those. There may be others, like I said, you'd have to go through and touch a lot of verses and deal with them, but these are the things I think that would come to your mind most readily. For example, Deuteronomy 17:17. Speaking of the king, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. And you see this idea here in 17:17, it's that the king shall not increase or add for himself, wives for himself, which can mean, see, that he shall not engage in polygamy at all. Not that he shall not engage in an excessive level of polygamy. You see, it just means he shall not increase or add. So we take it means multiply. It means he shouldn't have a ton of them. But that's not necessary with that word. He shall not increase or add. If he takes another wife, he's multiplied her, right? I mean, he's done two. But he shall not. So that's one that people look at and they say no. And in fact, again, the Qumran community understood this way. Understood Deuteronomy 17:17 to be an emphasis that the king is not to take another wife. So it has old roots in understanding it that way. Now, when God called David a man after his own heart in 1 Samuel 13:14, David was not yet a polygamist. In fact, he probably wasn't married then. So you can't go from that and say, okay, God is therefore blessing polygamy in what David is doing. Now, after David's adultery with Bathsheba and his killing of Uriah, God tells him in 2 Samuel 12:8, through the prophet Nathan, he tells him, I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your care. And I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added to you many more things like these. So is that God saying, I'm blessing a polygamous arrangement between you and Saul's wives? Well, God's giving to David, he's giving him Saul's house and his wives. That's a way of referring to the fact that he had given David all that Saul had when God brought David to the throne. See, David took over Saul's estate. He assumed Saul's estate, which was a sign of his succession as a king. Here is the king who has this great estate. I now succeed him as king, and I take over his estate. It doesn't mean that David married Saul's wives. It certainly doesn't mean that, because that would have him marrying his wife Michal's mother. You see, if he did that, he'd then be marrying his wife's mother, which was incest, condemned in Leviticus 18:17 and punishable by death. It does not mean that David then took these wives and married them and took them as his wives. It is a way of saying David has succeeded Saul as king and takes all of Saul's estate, all that Saul had. Now, the eulogizing statements. You remember what I'm doing here? I'm trying to say there are reasonable alternative interpretations of the text that are often taken to say, no, God here approves of polygamy. And I'm trying to give you some of the ones that I think would come to your mind, and I want to show you that there can be reasonable alternatives for this. The eulogizing statements, looking back on David's life and these statements that are made about him in 1 Kings 14:8 and in 1 Kings 15:5, they don't rule out that David did wrong in taking multiple wives. They should be seen in the context. I'll read them in a second. But they should be seen in the context as referring to David's remaining loyal and keeping God's commandments relating to idolatry. You see, I think the contextual restriction is David is being praised for this absolute loyalty regarding idolatry, in the realm of idolatry. Not as a general statement that David did no wrong. Let's look at the text. 1 Kings 14:7-9. Go tell Jeroboam, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because I exalted you from among the people and made you leader over my people Israel, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you, and yet you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart, doing only that which was right in my eyes. But you have done evil above all who were before you, and have gone and made for yourself other gods and metal images, provoking me to anger, and have cast me behind your back. You see, so we have this statement about David that we have here. Now, certainly David's conduct regarding Bathsheba and Uriah, God certainly isn't blessing that and sanctifying that conduct. When he says here, he followed me with all his heart and did only that which is right in my eyes, do you think God is saying it was really good for him to take Bathsheba and have Uriah killed? No, you recognize that there's some kind of restriction on the scope of this statement. Okay, what I'm suggesting to you is that the restriction is, it is in the realm of idolatry. That David remained loyal there to God in that realm. You see, that's where the writer's focus is. His focus is on the contrast between David and Jeroboam in terms of idolatry. Jeroboam was a notorious idolater. And so he's comparing Jeroboam, this notorious idolater, and he's not like David in that regard. You see, he's not like David in that regard. He was a rank idolater, whereas David followed God completely in terms of idolatry. Now you get a little trickier case here. Okay, 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 3 through 5. It says, and he's referring to Abijam, walked in all the sins of his father, he's referring to Rehoboam, all the sins that his father did before him, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him and establishing Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Okay, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Now, verse 3, as I say it, this refers to Abijam walking in all the sins of his father Rehoboam. 1 Kings 14, verses 22 and 23, it reports the rampant idolatry that took place in Judah during Rehoboam's rule. So right there at 14, 22, and 23, we got this description of the rampant idolatry that takes place during Rehoboam's rule. And then it says Abijam walked in the sins of his father, Rehoboam. So we again have this idolatry context. We have this context of idolatry. The reference to David's obedience seems to be focused again, you see, on the complete obedience to the commands relating to idolatry. Now, it's not as clear here. You got to go back to 14:22 to pick up the context, but I think that's exactly what's going on. You say, well, wait a minute. We have this last clause here that says, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Now, if in fact the intent was to restrict what's being talked about in terms of David's obedience, if it was to restrict it to the context of idolatry, well, then there would be no reason to accept from that context the sin of adultery and murder. You see, that seems to imply that the context is not restricted solely to idolatry. If it was, there would be no need to accept from that restricted context these sins, because they're not included in that context, right? You understand what I'm saying? Okay, so what's the deal? Then it sounds like what you're saying won't work. There is good reason to believe that this clause that I've just given to you is not in the original. That's why I have bracketed it. Good reason to believe that, you see. You say, well, do you just make this stuff up when you find things that are difficult to fit? Do you just make this stuff up? No, I really don't. It's not in the Septuagint. Well, that's significant, right? I mean, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew text from centuries before Christ. So when they were translating it, the text they were translating didn't include that clause. And that is the reason that nearly all scholars think that that clause that I've bracketed is an after-the-fact addition. John Gray, in his commentary, he says the Septuagint omits this clause, which indeed has all the appearance of a later gloss, and Simon de Vries, in his commentary, he omits translating it. When he's doing the translation in the commentary, he skips that clause. Mordecai Kogan, he says in his commentary in the Anchor Bible series, he says, because the phrase is lacking in the Septuagint, it is universally taken. So if you want to jump me on it, I'm telling you, I'm in good company. It's universally taken to be a post-Deuteronomic expansion, meaning a scribe stuck it in there because the scribe didn't appreciate the contextual limitation and said, well, we got this notorious case of Uriah that's all over the Bible, except in the case of Uriah. See, he didn't want anybody, so he sticks that in there. Here's what the Jewish Study Bible says on it. 1 Kings 15:5 originally limited itself to a comment praising King David, and one important manuscript of the ancient Greek translation of Kings, Vaticanus, preserves that original text. That's the Septuagint. A later scribe found the fulsome praise of David inconsistent with the story in 2 Samuel chapter 11. That story is exceedingly critical of David for committing adultery with the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his own soldiers, and for having Uriah murdered to ensure that the adultery was not discovered. Therefore, the scribe added a qualification in 1 Kings 15:5, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. These words became part of the Masoretic text. See, but what we care about is the original text. See, we want to know, what did the inspired writer write? And you can't use textual criticism just willy-nilly and say, well, that's not in there. There has to be good, solid reasons for this, and I'm giving you what I think are good, solid reasons. Okay, so in the context, then you say, well, this section can't be contextually limited to David's actions regarding idolatry, because if they were, then there would be no reason to accept from them his situation with Uriah. Okay, well, that's what I'm telling you. That text is probably not, so that then argument goes away. So now I think that the way to understand it is contextually limited to David's faithfulness and his obedience in the realm of idolatry. Now, if you understand it, if you take verse 5, you see, if you take verse 5 to be referring to David not doing wrong in any sphere of God's will, if you take that to be the case, if that's how you read it, well, then his sins couldn't be limited to those of Bathsheba and Uriah. He also sinned in taking the census of Israel, right? I mean, as noted in 2 Samuel 24:10 and 1 Chronicles 21, 1-8. So that, if you're just going to say except in the matter of Uriah, if you're saying it means all sins, the only sins David ever committed here. Well, we've got text that says that's not the case. So that reinforces for me that this was a later addition, because it struck the scribe to say, whoa, this is a notorious case. I got to throw in a footnote. You see, I got to throw in what is essentially a footnote. All right, a good case can be made that David, as part of his attitude of repentance toward God, during Absalom's rebellion. You remember Absalom rebels, and then David, he's repenting in relation to that situation. In 2 Samuel 15:30, a good case can be made that he returned to a monogamous relationship or a monogamous state with Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, as part of his repentance. You see, a case can be made that he did that for the rest of his life. Well, that would reinforce this idea that really the ideal, or God's desire, God's commandment out of Leviticus 18:18 is that no, you shouldn't be engaged in polygamy. And so there's a case to be made that David, in repentance in relation to the Absalom's rebellion, in fact returned to a monogamous relationship with Bathsheba, and that may be what's behind, the narrator, how he emphasizes that David didn't have sexual relations with Abishag the Shunammite. He sits there, he says, yeah, she kept him, but he didn't sleep with her. You see, he didn't. Why? Why keep saying that? Wouldn't that show David to be some kind of, great old virile dude? No, it just makes a point. You see, and it helps to understand why is the writer doing that. And that's something that we're there. Let me tell you how Richard Davidson summarizes his study of the polygamy question. He says, in the Old Testament, there are 33 reasonably clear historical cases of polygamy, out of approximately 3,000 men mentioned in the scriptural record. Most of these examples were the wealthy patriarchs or Israel's monarchs. The only clear case of a commoner having more than one wife, it should be is instead of in, Elkanah, this likely from the motive of Hannah's infertility. In the narratives containing the practice of polygamy or concubinage, invariably, the divinely inspired narrators include their tacit condemnation of these practices. Contrary to other ancient Near Eastern legislation, Mosaic legislation condemns all polygamy, both for the people and at least implicitly for the king. Unlike in the other ancient Near Eastern law codes and practice, there is no exception for cases of infertility or illness of the wife or for royal diplomatic alliances. None of the Pentateuchal legislation concerning marital forms commands or condones polygamous relationships, although remarriage after a man's first wife died is allowed. So, as I said, Flame of Yahweh, if you want to get more details and study, it's a good book. It's subtitled Sexuality in the Old Testament, but I think that's a worthy thing. So, we have this, I think a good case can be made that the Old Testament prohibits polygamy. But again, even if God did not affirmatively prohibit polygamy in the Old Testament, the most that could be said is that he tolerated it temporarily as a departure from his ideal. You see, we see the ideal shown to us in Genesis, and God then, if he tolerates it, he would tolerate it presumably for the same reason that he tolerated divorce. You see, and it may be a variation on that, is that he tolerated it during the patriarchal era because of the hardness of people's heart. And then he asserted his ideal. He asserted the ideal of monogamy in the Mosaic law in Leviticus 18:18. So that's just a variation on that, but that's the same idea. So I think it's a mistake to tie God to polygamy, but it seems that many have already swallowed that and they say, no, God's for it, and then they have other ways of looking at it. I want you to pause there for a while before you make that jump and say, in fact, it's clear that God endorses and embraces polygamy. Much more to be said on that, you see, than oftentimes you hear. Okay, next. Old Testament laws. What do the atheists say? Another thing, when they jump on it, the big categories I've been addressing, okay? I said, first, you remember the idea, well, there's no reason to believe Christian faith. No reason to believe God exists. It's just brainless, brain dead. They just believe crazy stuff, okay? We spent a long time talking about that first charge. The second was the existence of evil. And I made the case that it's not incompatible with the existence of the God of the Bible. Next is God is not a moral monster. I've been looking for weeks now at the atheist charge that God is a moral monster. In other words, God, if he exists as you think he is, in your Bible, he's a moral monster and you shouldn't worship him. I've been trying to deal with these charges, and there have been many. And I've looked at them one by one. Now the next category, and this is brief. I know I heard that, amen. Old Testament laws that seem odd to us. You wind up having these atheists, they mock the Old Testament for having regulations that seem to make no sense. You know, come on. Shellfish. All right. Drives me crazy, but that's another story. All right. They do make sense, you see. They do make sense, see, when one understands the culture into which these laws were given, and when one understands that Israel, the people to whom the laws were given, that Israel was a theocracy. It was a God-governed nation created to be God's special instrument for blessing for all nations of the earth. So there's something distinctive about Israel. There's something unique that God is doing with Israel. He created this nation, and he's using this particular nation to be a vehicle for his blessing. See, Israel's unique role in God's unfolding plan made Israel the object of some unique requirements. The food laws. The food laws and the regulations that you see against mixing different kinds of animals, different kinds of crops, different kinds of fabric, these carried symbolic messages. These carried symbolic messages in daily life about the boundaries God's people were to maintain with the people of other nations. These were like living parables, lessons, instructions. You have to be careful to separate and distinguish. This is very important. And so in the context of Israel, these rules and regulations carried symbolic messages about the boundaries between Israel and the people of other nations. They were not to mix with the unclean beliefs and the practices of the surrounding nations. You're not to mix different kinds of animals, different kinds of crops, different kinds of fabric. Oh, how stupid. Can it not be telling them, listen, you need to be isolated, segregated, not to mix with the practices and the morals of the people? Why? Every day I'm doing these things. You see, it's brought into the warp and woof of my daily existence. God is teaching Israel through these things because Israel is special in God's mission. And the food laws, they also may reinforce other things. They may be teaching other lessons, that they're to respect life, that they're not to be predators, that they are there to avoid conduct that reduces them to a state of helplessness. All of these implications have been drawn from the different food regulations that you see. So for somebody who first knows next to nothing about theology, to sit here 2,000 years later and laugh at the Creator God for what He's doing and say, oh, this is stupid, makes no sense, that just blows my mind. The hubris, the chutzpah. I said, come on, man. You know, what planet are you on? How can you not see that? They don't see it, and they just call you names. But so this is something. Now, the various regulations of ritual uncleanness or impurity. You see those things, right? These regulations about ritual uncleanness or impurity. See, which is different from moral impurity. These things are ritualistic, ritual contamination. Those things reinforce elements of God's holiness, His otherness. You see that. These things reinforce that. Bodily discharges related to sexual intercourse or to the cycle of birth and death. Those things temporarily keep one from worship for a number of possible. What possible reason could it have for God to have these discharges related to sexual intercourse, that somehow religiously contaminates me so that I cannot go and worship until that contamination has been removed? What could He possibly be doing with that? What can He possibly be doing when we have like menstrual blood that's going to contaminate so that I need to be ritually purified from that before I can go in and worship? Well, it seems God is radically separating sexuality from religious rites. You see, if there's sexuality involved, well, what happens? Well, now you have to be ritually purified before you can come worship. What is He doing? He's separating His worship from sex. Why would He do that? Because there were pagan religions that used sex in worship. You see, they used it. So what is God doing? He's showing His distinctiveness, His otherness, and He's separating that. And I got somebody sitting here looking back 2,000 years or further and sitting here talking about that. You see, so that's one of the things that you could see. And it seems that He's separating sexuality from religious rites. And it also may be that things related to the cycle of birth and death. You see, menstruating. Those things that are related to the cycle of birth and death defile one for worship, because unlike pagan gods, Yahweh is not subject to the cycle of birth and death. Maybe He's teaching that. That was the second bell? Okay, maybe He's teaching that, you see? So whereas you have these gods in the ancient world, what happens? They die and they come and die. And you see this? He's not like that. He's not subject to that cycle. Could God be teaching that lesson? Well, yeah, He could be. And in fact, I think He is. Thanks for overtime.